Howdy of you delicious people. I am here today to review The Faculty. So, this is a very interesting horror film. When looking at it, you see like just a cluster of just tons and tons of stars into this film. Like, there's an endless time of which that I could probably spend in the end talking about every single person in this movie and how they were all in such and such film and this and that, and I would just take hours telling where everybody is from and stuff like that, because everybody is just a big star from this movie. Here's the thing, though. I felt that this horror film felt very old-fashioned, even for the time of which that it came out, which was ultimately 1998. But uh, it felt like it was trying to dip from the old-fashioned bandwagon of horror films. Like, it kind of almost had a quasi like approach to it as like an old-fashioned horror film. If anything, they're also in this movie they end up dipping into telling you exactly where they're getting their resources from, which I think is very interesting. When you always have a horror film, or you always have some kind of movie that tells you where the origins of what the writers were thinking. And pretty straightforward. They end up basically just telling you, it's like, well, we got this idea from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or Puppet Master is really just the origin of the story. But then they have to kind of also just kind of mix in a bunch of other alien movies during that period of time. So to make it just seem like, oh, well, we just didn't quite just watch two horror movies and that's all we did. So going into here, I think I enjoy this movie for its simplicity, where it's just like, hey, we're gonna just tie this school into uh, this entire real infection or invasion, if you by say it. And I think that this is actually a much more smarter approach than just having a neighborhood of sorts that ultimately one by one you have to infect. If anything, I think a school is a much more smarter route when writing for an alien invasion story. And I'm surprised they don't otherwise kind of go into this a lot more and have it ultimately be this kind of approach for having a easier spread uh, alien thing within everyone. Reasonably, it seems that this alien is ultimately just a small thing about like finger-ish like size that would otherwise go into a portion of ear or through any holes of which you have in your body to ultimately be done as a host. Me looking at this and realizing it's like, oh, so this alien host is almost like a Venom of sorts. I had seen the Tom Hardy movie Venom, and so reasonably when watching this movie, it kind of made me think of that. But when looking at it, you have it to where the alien has to rely on being hydrated, being watered down. So I was like, okay, well, can't you just be able to kill this thing with just a very hot climate? Because when looking at it, it seems like these things desperately at some point needed to be hydrated. So if you could have found a source that completely like dehydrates something, then when under that circumstance, reasonably, the only thing that I thought was goofy about this film was the introduction of a drug to otherwise wipe this thing out. I think that that was kind of a goofy concept. I think going into this movie, I think the thing that really does sell this movie the best is really just the top notch actors that are consistently within this film. Josh Hartnett's uh, Elijah Woods, Christopher McDonald, uh, Selma Hayek, Famke Janssen. The list goes on and on and on. Usher, even in this film as well. Jon Stewart also in this film, kind of bringing the comedy at some specs. Ultimately, knowing full well I had seen this movie before, kind of the thing that Jon Stewart mentions in the early portion of this film, I think is kind of hilarious because eventually, if you've seen this film more than once, you ultimately realize where Jon Stewart's character ends up going within this film. So going into this movie, I thought that reasonably having the faculty be the main culprit that are easily going to spread this invasion, this alien, this whatever, and ultimately when you start to see the faculty shift one by one, and then eventually have them eventually go into trying to mass figure out how to spread this infection even further on. Like, I thought reasonably that this movie was just like there was some portions of it where I was like, man, this movie is brilliant. Like just a one of a kind piece that no one tried to even get close to, like trying to mimic or whatever. I know there was one movie where we had it to where there was one film where we had like teachers who ended up becoming robots, and ultimately that ended up to where all the robots eventually like started going after their students. And I think they might have made sequels to that movie, but I don't know. But anyways, I thought that this movie was I thought this movie was great. I thought this movie was smart, even though I thought like the whole drug thing was kind of goofy to me. It's like you're really relying on the fact that there is some uh, some kind of shady esh like character at your school that is selling drugs. Like if we were to try and do this movie nowadays, with there being so many security guards within school or so many uh, like you would have so many schools that have like metal detectors now and all kinds of crazy absurd like things, so it's not like anybody could just get away with anything now. Plus, if there is a person that is going to be held under suspicion, then yeah. So I like this movie for its intelligence, but then also I feel like there are some things where it kind of also, on the opposite end, just kind of insults my intelligence or makes it to where it really just seems that some people aren't realizing the difference in certain characters, where all of a sudden they are like having drastic shifts or drastic changes in personalities, and no one catches up on that. And there is also some characters that have like subtle things, but reasonably within that subtleness, there is reasonably at a point in time where nobody's picking up on who these people really are until it's absolutely too late. Like, it's not like the movie Disturbing Behavior, where somebody's wearing a biker jacket, and then once they turn, they're all wearing like prep clothes, and they're all wearing ribbons, and they're all like wearing blue jeans and like being all Fonzie. No, um, like they did in Disturbing Behavior. So I think that's about all that I really wanted to say in a very cryptic like sense with this movie. I think that really the guy who ends up playing the coach in this film, which is Robert Patrick, Coach Joe Willis. I think really that character more than anybody else, like, stands out. If anything, I was so impressed with the coach's kind of beginning scene with him and the principal, let's just say. And I think that point really sells the movie more so than anything else. And also, I think reasonably we have it to where uh, we have eventually towards the end of this film. I think the effects that ultimately go into the to the thing that happens towards the end of the film, I think that those are actually pretty solid effects. Like, I'm not watching this movie and just going like, man, this thing looks out of place. If by thing, you'll know what I talk about when I talk about towards the end of the film. So let's go out of our way to ultimately go into spoilers about this movie. I enjoy it. I think it still holds up. I think reasonably it's still a great film. Because if anything, like, I love Invasion of the Body Snatchers movies. I've seen all of them now. I've seen even the black and white version of it, and I think all of these are just kind of very interesting films. I like the whole infection thing where you have it to where this alien thing is spreading to person to person to person to person, and then you have a person that uh, you think is completely not connected with him or her being an alien, and then all of a sudden you are just, oh my god, wait a minute, she's one of them, oh no. That kind of thing. So let's go out of our way to ultimately go into the double five to otherwise say, yeah, this movie still holds up. I think it's still a great film, and hopefully at the end of the day, if you've never seen The Faculty, I believe it's on I think it's on Peacock TV. I guess it's the free option. When looking at it, I would probably just say to go out of your way to go into any movie app of some sort. Kind of scroll through any movie apps to ultimately see if they have that here there, and just watch it for free. More like a Movie Pro or a TV Crush or a whichever app that Darren Fact is still an existing movie app thing. Play box or movie boxes or stuff like that. Ultimately, check those out. So, without a doubt, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil. Whew! This movie. So, reasonably, we have at the fairly beginning of this movie, we have it to ultimately, we have the principal, which is BB Newirth, um, that is Principal Valerie Drake. So we have it to where Drake is ultimately talking about the budget, and if we have it ultimately to where we see we ultimately see Patrick, Robert Patrick, ultimately seemingly going and having football practice, and ultimately we see Robert Patrick, who is seemingly talking to some person in the shadows, and it seems like, hey, whoever you are, you're going to be doing some laps. And we ultimately have this person come out of the shadows to supposedly infect Coach Joe. And we ultimately have our principal talking about budget, and we have it to a reasonably, it seems that some teachers are kind of just bickering about like, well, of course the football team is going to get their new jerseys and their new this and their new that, and of course the principal's like, well, yeah, of course they are, because reasonably they are the ones that are bringing in the money, they're bringing in the profit. So we have it to where ultimately they are making budget cuts. We have one of the teachers, Miss Karen Olsen, who's talking about wanting to put together a guys and dolls play, and ultimately Drake is ultimately just going, well, maybe we'll put something together. So we have it to where ultimately Principal Drake goes into the office, and we have to where the coach is to meet her there. Ultimately, desperately asking, it's like, wow, Miss Drake, you look wonderful today. Do you happen to have a pencil? And we have to where Principal Drake is like, you know what, Coach, how about you go and just sleep it off? Like, obviously, you look a little drunk, so how about you just sleep it off? So, we ultimately have to where the coach is consistently asking, it's like, well, do you have a pencil? And so, we have to where Principal Drake is ultimately just like, here's your pencil. What are you going to do with your pencil? What are you going to do? So we have it to our coach ends up driving this pencil into this principal's hand. And she's like, oh my God. And he's like, oh, I've always ever wanted to do that. So we have it to where Principal Drake ends up clawing the coach's face, and then she runs out of the gate. We have seemingly the coach that is ultimately getting on the loudspeaker and ultimately asking for Principal Drake to report to the principal's office. So we have to where Principal Drake is ultimately trying to uh, get out of the school, but it seems like the doors are bizarrely locked from the outside, which makes no rational sense. Like, why would they be locking those doors that well? I've never seen a school that would do anything like that. But anyways, we have it to where Karen Olsen is ultimately mentioning, it's like, well, hey, like, I don't have my keys, so I can't let you out. And ultimately, Principal Drake mentions, like, well, yeah, I forgot my keys because they're in my office. I'm like, man, you would think with all these people, with all these faculty members, all of them wouldn't figure that they should leave all their keys. So we have Principal Drake who ends up scrambling back into her office to scramble back all the way to get to this door to eventually have the coach chasing after her, and eventually we have it to where the principal gets outside of the door, ultimately to just get stabbed by Karen Olsen. So I'm like, shouldn't the principal have been dead then? But no, evidently she just immediately comes back and is one of these alien creatures of sorts. So we push on. So reasonably, we have it to where seemingly now we have to showcase all of the all of the people that are seemingly going to be a prominent role within this movie. We have Elijah Wood that is getting his uh, Johnson thoroughly bashed in via a flagpole. We ultimately have people coming to the fray. We ultimately have Stan and Stokely, who consistently seem to be knocking into one another consistently. I guess it just makes it to be a joke at some point. I'm wondering how many numerous times within this movie did they have to cut a scene where Stan and Stokely were just smacking into one another. But anyways, we ultimately see a character called Mary Beth, who is seemingly the new kid in school, and immediately I'm like, yeah, really, I could never trust the new kid in school. Ultimately, in a lot of app games, normally it would have it be some story where you would have like a ton of the times it's always like you're the new kid in school. So we ultimately have Josh Hartnett that is seemingly giving some kids some fake IDs, and then ultimately he's going and giving them drugs for free. Ultimately, Josh Hartnett's character is called Zeke. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably that we have it to queue up into the faculty lounge. We ultimately have it to where we see seemingly John Stewart, who is Professor Edward Furlong, and he is ultimately just kind of talking to some of the faculty, ultimately talking to the nurse that ultimately is sick, and Furlong is ultimately mentioning to Selma Hayek, which is the nurse, like, well, hey, like, Nurse Rosa Harper, hey, like, why aren't you, if you're sick, why not just stay home? And she's like, no, I only use up my sick days when I'm feeling better. So it's like, well, that's good to tell everybody. So we ultimately have it to a reasonably Furlong is talking to another one of the teachers. Uh, oh, come on. Come on, give it to me. Give me the. That's what I hate about. I wish they would like order it in appearance of people that would be on the movie. Um, uh, Dr. John Tate. There we go, or Mr. John Tate. So we have to refer along as talking to Mr. Tate, and it seems that reasonably they are looking over at the coach, and coach is just like, he is just drinking like a mother out of this water jug. And we ultimately have Furlong that is mentioning to Tate. It's like, oh my god, like what is it? Like, man, what is up with him? He's just drinking away over there. And we have it to her, Mr. Tate is like, yeah, it must be some pre-game ritual. And Furlong, yeah, is like, yeah, but he makes me want to pee. So we ultimately have it to her ultimately. Uh, Wait a minute, seriously? Somebody had to, like, wow. So, wait a minute. So, we have it within the credits, I guess, maybe, of this movie that literally some people's names are called FU boy, where it's like you literally have to say the FUCK and then you boy. And there's also an FUCK girl. Wow. All right. Well, that's weird. That ultimately you have to have that relationship that ultimately went sour in the movie, as you could see in the film. Uh, anyways, I just thought that that was absurd. So we ultimately have Karen Olsen, who ultimately comes in, and we have it to where the principal is like, "Oh my God, you look so lovely today," because of course she is now different. So we ultimately have it to where we're going through our day, and it seems that we eventually seemingly have it to where Stan is to ultimately be a guy that is otherwise wanting to quit the football team because ultimately he wants to rely on his grades and his brain instead of his brawn. And so we ultimately have it to where seemingly Stan is going to tell the coach that he is going to quit the football team, and we have it to where the coach just takes it fairly easily. And Stan is very confused by that. It's like, shouldn't you be ripping my head off? Like, shouldn't you be like really like mad at me? And the guy's like, well, like like if anything, like I'm concerned about the human condition. The coach is like this. So I'm just trying to just like there has to be some reason why you're like having to pull out and no longer play football. So like I'm not going to get in the way of that. So we have a tourist stand. Ultimately, is kind of feeling relieved that ultimately this coach isn't ripping his head off right now. But we have a tourist stand. Ultimately, goes in the shower to ultimately not be left alone. We ultimately have it to where Stan is to ultimately be attacked by seemingly one of the teachers that is ultimately much older and cannot actually take the ability of being one of them, one of the alien races, and so ultimately her body just keels over and dies. So we ultimately have it to where Stan and Elijah's character, ultimately Casey, walks in, or Casey ends up walking in on seemingly Stan being attacked by this old lady and him basically being butt naked and so on and so forth. So we ultimately have it to where the files are being reported and stuff along those lines. And so eventually we have it to where seemingly Casey and Casey and Casey and Delilah Prophet are going into the faculty and going and trying to find some dirt on seemingly the faculty lounge. If interesting enough, like we get a point in time where Casey is also trying to have lunch on the football field, and the coach intercepts him. They're like, "Hey, like, if anything, like the coach mentions, like, hey man, like you look like an athlete. Like, have you ever like ran or anything like that?" And Casey's like, "I don't think the only time that I think you should run is if you're ever being chased." And coach is like, I like that. It's like, yeah, yeah. So you have a tour ultimately. So Casey is to go with Delilah and go and inspect the the faculty lounge, and we ultimately find that they end up going into the closet while two teachers are arriving within this place, ultimately mentioning how many faculty members that they have infected so far, and that ultimately they are going to go into further infecting more people. And so reasonably, we have it to where eventually the nurse ends up going in there and ends up getting infected as well. We have it to where the coach ultimately gets on top of her and infects her with in the ear with a alien thing, and we have it to where ultimately uh, Delilah and Casey are just kind of just godsmacked within this locker, or in this closet, to where they're kind of just fumbling around, to where they end up finding that the old lady that ended up dying in the bath, or dying in the shower room with Stan, ultimately still in the faculty closet and is still just dead there. So we end up having Casey and Delilah end up running out of this faculty closet, and then they're running out of the school to eventually call the police, to ultimately have it to where uh, Casey is to bring the police and bring his mother and father into this, which ultimately brings in Christopher McDonald, which ultimately a lot of people know from just tons and tons of movies, and I love this actor. Um, Usually he would play the tough guy, the guy that you would love to hate at some points in movies. But anyways, you have it within here that ultimately you have Elijah Wood that is desperately trying to get his story across, and reasonably absolutely no one is believing him. Basically, a lot of people are saying already that it's like, oh yeah, you cried wolf. None of this is really true. If anything, there is no real true proof because Delilah isn't here to back everything up. And so we have it to where ultimately we have it to where the police officers are easily swayed by the principal. It seems like there is no real true evidence there uh, because the nurse had seemingly been fine, and the principal had been evident of that, and pretty much all the faculty members uh, have been changed into being aliened Anyways, so reasonably, it's just kind of like it's their word against one kid. So we have a tour. The principal ultimately is to have the police officers ultimately go into her office, and you just kind of hear a loud bang within her office, and immediately you're just like, yeah, he got infected. Yeah, he's one of them. And then ultimately, once they come out of the office, we have the police officer going like, yeah, he's like, this kid just wanted some attention, and there's no way any of this is true. And you can just tell by his like blank expression that he's one of them. To where easily Casey is looking at him and he's like, yeah, you're one of them now. So we ultimately have it to where Casey is to go home to have his father tear apart his room looking for the drugs or something like that. It seems like his parents are going to set him up for seeing some doctor. And so we have it to where Casey is ultimately going and seeing his father rummage through his room, tear things apart, and then ultimately find and ground him, taking away like radios and like all kinds of stuff that you probably wouldn't see as a real necessary like thing now. like oh no, ground him from his radio. Oh no, that's the worst thing that you could do. But I think the worst thing that he probably did was take his porn stash. Come on, Dad. Come on, you took his stash? Come on. Anyways, so we have for ultimately Casey is to ultimately is just to be going into school even though he doesn't want to go because his father is telling him like, well, if I have to tie you down to your desk, you're going to go. So we have to where Casey's ultimately going to go within this school to immediately start to see bizarre things going on. There's a long line of stretch of things going on because people are getting supposedly ear inspections. And we have it to where people are consistently being called into the principal's office. I guess the most influential people. We ultimately have it to where Delilah is grabbing Casey and talking to him within the bathroom to ultimately kind of confirm what is all going on and confirm that ultimately Delilah is incognito. And we have it to where it's kind of like we're ultimately trying to understand and figure out what is all really and truly going on. Like, did they really truly saw what they thought that they saw? And where like this thing is quickly and easily spreading. So eventually we get it to where Stan and Stokely are also starting to realize that there is something odd going on. If anything, we have to where Stokely is poking her head in to eventually see what they are actually doing with these people that they're calling in. And so we ultimately have to where it seems that like Stan and Stokely are starting to slowly but surely find some things odd, but I think Stan is kind of trying to live in ignorant bliss. So we ultimately pushing on have seemingly Zeke, who is going and talking to his guys that he would otherwise deal whatever stuff to, and mostly drugs in this instance. We ultimately have it where Zeke is going and giving these two guys drugs, and ultimately they were asking for more. It's like, give us all that you got. And Zeke is like, yeah, no, I'm not going to give you every single thing. To ultimately he's starting to hide his stash because he's like, God, why are they asking for every little bit of what I have? This seems weird. So we eventually have it to where right behind Zeke, we ultimately have it to where we have Miss Elizabeth Burke. If anything, before we have Burke, who ultimately changes, it seems that Burke had ultimately gone to Zeke and ultimately said, like, God, what made you want to have to redo your entire senior year? Like, if anything, you were so close to graduating. Like, what made you wanted to, like, just kind of throw your life away? We ultimately have it to where Mrs. Burke was ultimately trying to support Zeke, trying to ultimately, like, just going like, dude, you're throwing your life away, kid. And the entire time Zeke is ultimately trying to get her, to offend her, to get her to go away. Ultimately, mentioning about laxatives, and then ultimately mentioning about uh, cherry flavored protection that ultimately she could lace herself up with at some point in time. And so eventually that joke will pay off later. So we have to where now Zeke is having to give these guys all these drugs, and then we have it to where Elizabeth Burke is now looking a lot more uh, uh, seductive, I guess you could say, because ultimately everybody's like whistling at Miss Burke, like woohoo, woo woo, Miss Burke got a little change up. So Miss Burke ultimately is coming on down and ultimately having to get right into Zeke's face, ultimately telling him that she is going to stick her foot so far up his butt that she will be that he'll be licking her toes till graduation, because ultimately she is just tired of his act. Ultimately, kind of mentioning how his parents never really wanted him and all these kinds of garbage, and Zeke is just like, come on, bring it on. Like, what other kind of garbage are you gonna say to just feel like you can, like, really just get to me or affect me or whatever? So we have it to where ultimately Zeke ends up selling all of his seemingly all of his items, and ultimately seems to be the smartest guy in class. To where ultimately, when he is in some class, some school or whatever, we ultimately have it to where Casey ended up finding. I'm kind of skipping around a little bit, but Casey ended up when he was at that football field and going into because there's a reason why I'm kind of skipping around for this movie. We ultimately have it to where Casey is going and being on the football field while he ate lunch, and ultimately was mentioning to the coach that it's like, I only want to run when I'm being chased. To ultimately when Casey is to uh, be coming back to the school to confront this school about what has gone on, we ultimately have it to where the coach is mentioning it's like, hey, like, you should join our track and field. There's plenty of chasing out there. And we have it to where Casey's father is like, yeah, he told you were fast. Isn't that great? Maybe there's an athlete out of you yet. So but moot point, we ultimately have Casey who found some amphibian like thing, some species onto the football field, and and Casey brings that into Furlong, and Furlong, ultimately John Stewart, ends up uh, going and trying to dissect this thing and seeing like how it all works. It's kind of like the Gremlin scenario, where we ultimately have this thing that ultimately Furlong ends up putting into water and seeing it multiply, and then eventually nibbling at his finger a little bit. So we have to ultimately, while that's going on, Zeke is ultimately going onto a microscope and ultimately just kind of being the smartest kid in class and just kind of figuring out some things along with Furlong. So we ultimately have it to where Zeke is seemingly winning over Mary Beth, to the point where it seems that we find out that Zeke is just kind of like looking over this new girl and ultimately just kind of finding out things about her. So eventually, when him and her ultimately go into this office to uh, have Zeke get his office supplies, meaning his drug supplies, where Mary Beth says, like, oh, are you borrowing this stuff? And ultimately Zeke says, I'd like to think that it's stealing. So we have to where seemingly Mary Beth and Zeke both have this kiss and really cementing that, like, yeah, like somebody's going to get in trouble, but they never do. So, but Zeke mentions if they do seemingly have somebody walk in on them to ultimately just kiss, and the punishment will be less severe. So, going into here, we push on. So, reasonably, we have it to where it seems that everybody is kind of slowly but surely coming to the consensus that there could quite possibly be a alien invasion. We have it to where Casey is talking to Stokely in the library, kind of mentioning and figuring out like what kind of movie that this is. Like, is it Puppet Master? Is it Invasion of the Body Snatchers? Is it Men in Black? Is it any other Spielberg movie that ultimately we've seen at some point in time? Ultimately, just kind of mentioning that, like, maybe Casey has the theory that maybe the reason why there are so many alien movies and stuff like that out there is to make it seem to us that that would never actually be a possibility that that could ever happen by someone who is an alien that is writing these kinds of stories, that is making that is giving us a false sense of security or safety or whatever by ultimately having it to be that this person is an alien trying to do a story about if an alien invasion were to happen, to just kind of give us like, oh, well, that clearly could never happen, or this could never. So it's kind of giving us that like warm that's kind of giving us that blanket that we put upon ourselves as we go to bed at night, to ultimately just be like, oh, well, like that's never going to really and truly happen, kind of suspense of disbelief kind of thing. So we ultimately have it to where we have these kids that are all kind of walking around this school, and we eventually have it to where all of these kids go into the like Furlong science lab. We ultimately have it to where Zeke and Mary Beth make it to there later, uh, because ultimately they're going and getting supplies. So we have it to where ultimately the subjects that ultimately Casey had brought Furlong are ultimately gone, and we eventually have Furlong go into the classroom. And Casey's like, "Hey, like, what happened to the test subjects?" And Furlong says, "Well, I sent them out to be studied." It's like, well, were there any results that came back? And he ultimately just shrugged his shoulders and like, meh. We eventually have it to where seemingly Zeke and them ultimately try to leave, and Furlong stops them, and we have it to where Furlong ultimately mentions, like, you know what, I think we should all have you guys just take a seat, and this will be over shortly. And so while it seems that they can't leave this classroom, they just decide to otherwise attack Furlong. And like this is such an interesting like this whole fight sequence here looks visually just so cool. And ultimately it's like it looks really cool on Jon Stewart's side, but then also on everyone else's side. We have like Josh Hartnett that is like ripping uh this paper cutter thing from off this thing. We have it to where Josh Hartnett gets like crashed through uh, the uh, the aquarium, and like all this water goes everywhere. We have these fingers being chopped off by Jon Stewart's character, and all these fingers are kind of floating everywhere to seemingly all of these other people to maybe quite possibly infect them. And like just a real interesting visual like fight out, if you want to say that. We ultimately have to where seemingly a pen is to be jogged into a pen is to be shoved into Jon Stewart's eye to ultimately showcase that foreshadowing to where Jon Stewart had said earlier that, like, why not just somebody put a pen in my eye? Leading to where later on in the movie he literally gets a pen in the eye. So we have it to where ultimately this drug is to be introduced within Jon Stewart's body into going into his system, and it dries Jon Stewart's character out. So that's how they figure, like, oh, okay, well, he must have been an alien, and this was the drug to seemingly defeat him. Huzzah for us. So we end up having it to where they all otherwise decide to, like, dude, we need to get out of here. And so while they're doing that, they are having some temptation with some of the people within the school told me go like, oh, well, hey, like, you guys are going to play with us kind of thing? Like, oh, come on. Like, yeah, we know that you know that we know that you know kind of thing. And so we have it to where these guys, with all these kids, they end up just driving off. They drive off all to end up figuring out who is infected within their group because there's so many of them. So we ultimately have it to where everybody has to test whether or not that they are aliens or not, but they have to do this more than once at some point in this movie. So we have it to where Elijah Wood is end up trying it, and ultimately he's tweaking out. We end up having Stan try it, and of course he's kind of like, we have Zeke who's trying it, and he's completely fine. So ultimately that is really just left for Stokely and Mary Beth and Delilah to try it. So we have it to where Stokely ends up trying it, and she's completely fine. So we end up having it to where Delilah and Mary Beth have to take the drugs at the same time. We ultimately have it to where Mary Beth had mentioned earlier that she has horrible allergies, and something as simple as Tylenol could ultimately just give her like kind of some kind of illness that if anything stronger than that could kill her. Then so we have to where Zeke is like, you have to try this, you have to do this, and so we have to where seemingly Mary Beth is seemingly trying it, but we end up having Delilah, who ultimately does not actually go through with this, but it seems like she might have. So we have to where Stan ultimately goes and tries to comfort Delilah to ultimately see that she is actually infected because there's like things going all over her face, special effects, and so on and so forth. So we find out that Delilah is infected. We have to where Stokely is putting a gun upon her, and Delilah ends up running out of this garage or whatever that they are from, and she just runs off while Stokely is firing at her, which I thought that this was a very interesting visual of how they just run off. So we go on to here, and so ultimately their grand master plan is to ultimately find the queen, which I'm like, okay, how is it that you can just make sense of all that to just find the queen? Like you would just have to basically just kill every single person in this school to figure out who it is, because one, there might not always be a queen, and yeah, it's so. But I guess just like I think that they just needed to just go. It's like, well, we don't want to have to try to kill every single infected person off in this movie. How about we just make it simple and we just say that there is one queen that could kind of just dissolve all of this, kind of like the vampire like scenario where you'd have like a god, what is it called? Like I want to call it like a sired thing, where ultimately if you kill the person that infected you, then you're fine. But anyways, so going on in here, we have to ultimately their plan is to find the queen, which I'm like, So it has to be a female person. That makes no sense. And I think really and straightforward, they kind of go with the principal, which I'm like, isn't that kind of the easiest route to go into? Like, yeah, like let's have it to be the principal. It's like, obviously, excuse me, obviously they don't know who got infected first, and I think just going with the principal just seemed very absurd. But anyways, so we have a tour. Ultimately, it is led to them trying to decipher who the queen is. And so ultimately, they are thinking, like, well, maybe it's the principal, maybe it's the coach, it must be a faculty member. So they end up tying up the principal within this volleyball netting, and then they end up dousing most of their drug upon the queen. They shoot her in the head, and that doesn't work. But then eventually they douse her with the drug, which ultimately kills her. So they're like, "Well, is everybody changed? Like, I think everything's okay." So we end up having Stan going out there, just going, I'm gonna go and see. I'm gonna be the guy that ultimately is gonna think that everything's gonna be okay. Because ultimately they have some like homecoming game or some big game to where they could easily infect all these kinds of people. Like I thought it was an interesting kind of visual where you have like a football show going on, and you have it to where the alien team is infecting the other team. But I also thought it was really hilarious how this high school has so much effing pyro that they could just be blasting off repetitiously, to where you just have these interesting effects, and you have the coaches going, "Ooh, wow, pyro!" Like I thought that was just hilarious. So we have a tour ultimately within this film that so Stan goes out there and he tries to check out like what's all going down. Like, hey coach, you shouldn't be infected, right? And you have it where the coach is just like, I'm infected. Hey guys, we're all infected, everybody. Let's have a good time. So we ultimately have a tour reasonably. Stan is going his way to uh, just knock on the door and just be like, "Hey guys, I'm back. If anything, the coach is after me, and he's really, really fast." And so ultimately, we have to have it to where the people are just like, "Well, is Stan infected? We now have to check." And so reasonably, we have it to where Zeke has his one last reserve thing of drugs, and he gives it to Stan. Stan ends up and going to put it up against his nose, but then dumps it out. She's like, "Ha ha ha! I am infected." And we have it to where Stan is now trying to convince Stokely to be one of him. Like, it could be so much better. It could be so much better if you were with me. Because ultimately, Stokely ends up kissing Stan before he leaves. So we end up also like, and there's also so many interesting like lines that end up getting delivered between people, uh kind of like the transaction between Zeke and Stan at this moment, where we have it uh to where Zeke is ultimately egging Stan on to get in there, like, I'll show you some freaking pain. So we have it to ultimately Stan runs off, and like they basically have seemingly diddly squat worth of drugs left. So Zeke has to go and run off to go to his car to get a remaining supply of pens. And so we have it to where Elijah runs off after, or runs off with him. And so we eventually have it to where reasonably, uh, while that is going on, we ultimately have it to seemingly have Mary Beth have some one-on-one time with Stokely and just chat it out. Just go like, you know what, like, seems like people are labeling you as a lesbian or an outcaster or whatever. Like, you know what? Like, wouldn't it just be nice for you to just be like be a part of the group kind of thing? Wouldn't it be nice if you uh like just uh wouldn't have to hide anymore? Like, I'm tired of hiding anymore. And we ultimately find out that seemingly uh Mary Beth is ultimately seemingly one of the aliens. But let's get back to that. So we ultimately have it to where Zeke and Casey are ultimately running off to go and meet some of their cherished loved ones, seemingly. Because we have it to where ultimately Casey is told me to go into a bus where he meets Delilah, and ultimately Delilah is trying to whisper sweet nothings into Casey. Told me just like why can't you just be one of us, Casey? Like, you know, it'd be good for you. Like, we can do it together and all this kind of like romantic entanglement kind of thing that like Delilah is really like laying it on strong, because in the early portion of the movie, like, Casey was hitting on Delilah. And so we have a troll to me. Casey ends up uh, kind of jumping uh, through this escape hatch of this bus to evade um, not only Delilah but the football character that is trying to make his way through the escape hatch in the back of the bus. And we have her Casey just repetitiously continues to run off to try to evade all these aliens. So we have Zeke is making his way to his car, and ultimately his drugs are not in his trunk; they are in his front seat. And so while he is going and closing his trunk, we end up ultimately seeing Miss Burke there, and we have it to where Miss Burke is like, you know what? I think I'm kind of interested in making a deal with you today, Zeke. And Zeke's like, oh, so are you certain to be intrigued with the chocolate laxatives? And she's like, no, I think I need something a little bit of a cherry flavor. So we have to our Zeke is ultimately going, oh, are you sure that you're really ready for that kind of thing? So we end up having Zeke kind of having this moment of trying to get as close as he possibly can, slowly but surely, to the front of his car, and then he kind of quickly jumps into his front seat to drive off. And we have it to ultimately Burke ends up smashing her way through this window to be flown or be tossed into Zeke's back seat, where we ultimately have her kind of seducing him and almost taking her alien tongue and kind of giving Zeke little alien sweet nothings and tonguing of sorts. And we ultimately have to where Zeke ends up just uh, smashing his car into this bus, flinging Burke out of this car, and we just kind of see her head just become this like octopus like thing, and eventually is trying to reconnect to her body, which is just an it's absurd image. And we ultimately have it to where Zeke's like, "F this." So we have it to where Zeke makes it back to this place, and so we have it to where ultimately, uh, and Casey is ultimately also making it there, to where Stokely is to mention to Casey that Mary Beth is one of them. So we have it to where uh, Casey and Stokely are running off to see this giant monster trying to chase after them, and we end up having Stokely end up being smacked uh, and pushed into this, smacked off to the side, and then dragged in this pool to eventually become one of them. And so we have Casey who is just running off into all this craziness. And so we have it to where eventually that Zeke ultimately makes it down to try to find everybody. And so Zeke ends up going and talking to eventually what is the new Stokely and the new Mary Beth. I say the new Mary Beth because ultimately Mary Beth is naked, which I thought was hilarious. So we have to where Zeke is talking to both these girls, and the funniest thing that ends up happening is Zeke has to mention Mary Beth, why are you naked? She's like, what? Do you not like what you see? And he's like, it's like anything like that body is some hypnotizing motherfucker. So we have it to where seemingly Zeke is being attacked from both sides, and so Zeke ends up getting out of this via being helped, and so reasonably we have it to where they kind of just run off because Casey ends up shoving Stokely into this cage where she can be held in, and we ultimately have it to where Mary Beth runs off. So we have it to where Zeke and Casey are just kind of running around through these lockers to hide from this monster, and so Zeke tells Casey to take a thing of drugs because it's like, dude, everybody became an alien like since I've been gone, so you need to prove to me again that you're human. So we have to where Casey, like, wouldn't it have been interesting if the entire time that Casey would have been one of these aliens the entire time? Wouldn't that have been interesting? Wouldn't that have just thrown a big old wrench into all of this jazz? Where all of a sudden Casey was the alien the entire time and nobody knew? Or what if he would have been the queen the whole entire time and no one would have known? And Zeke would have been like the last defense for the human race. That would have been interesting. But anyways, so we have it to where ultimately we find out that one, Mary Beth is the queen, and so because she's the new kid, so ultimately there had to be something that really stuck out about that. And so reasonably we have it to where ultimately Zeke is trying to make his move to try to attack the queen, and he fails. He ends up getting smashed against Locker, so Casey is the last defense. We ultimately have it to where seemingly Mary Beth is talking to ultimately Casey, like, wouldn't it just be better if like you were just one of us? Wouldn't it just feel great? And and Casey's like, nah, I'd rather be dead. So we ultimately have it to where there is a runoff where the monster just starts attacking Casey, running after him, and so eventually we have it to where Casey ends up using these bleachers to run underneath these bleachers and start activating them to where they start closing all in, which I think is the best way to attack this kind of monster. And I think every once in a while you kind of see this movie being done where you eventually have people being killed underneath bleachers, which I think is kind of a cool approach. But anyway, so we have this monster that is following Casey through these bleachers and eventually towards the very tail end ends up getting stuck. And we have to where this alien is ultimately just tossing some aliens into Casey's face, but Casey ends up stabbing, of course, like this alien in the with this pen in the eye. And we have it to where we have Casey mentioning it's like you wouldn't have liked it here anyways, as this alien just is ending up just melting away. So we have it to where ultimately now there's an aftermath after this, and there's some things here that I tended to forgot. I thought it was really interesting to see. God, we had the one teacher, I believe, Mr. Tate, where ultimately he was a drinker or whatever, and once he switches, we see him do a class, and ultimately he is telling everybody like, okay, like I want you to list every single known relative that you know, ones that are local and eventually ones that are kind of closer to the most local place here, and so on and so forth. And we have it to where some kid ultimately is asking, it's like, is this going to be on the test? And we have it to where Mr. Tate's going like, this is the test, which I thought that that was the most interesting thing to do. So we end up having it to where reasonably uh, but also, yeah, Usher's in this movie. I forgot to mention Usher is in this film, and man, does he do a great. Man, is he great in this movie? Just really, just the small stuff that he delivers, the just uncomfortableness that he provides for the other characters to just kind of make them kind of concerned about uh, Usher being infected and so on. So great, like Usher in this movie does small little things, but he always does amazing stuff. So, but pushing on, so reasonably we have it to where, and there's probably little small things that when looking at it, that like probably should be important in this review, and I probably forgot about it because there's so much that I could have deciphered and could have talked about and stuff like that. Like there's so many interesting lines that were being delivered in this film, and like I'm begrudgingly trying to get through this as quickly as possible. Plus, I've already been talking for an hour, anyways. But anyways, we have a tour ultimately. Casey is the hero of this town, and so ultimately, seemingly a month after this whole thing had been resolved, we have it to ultimately like news reporters are consistently coming to Casey daily, wanting to get his story, and we ultimately have several kind of news articles that it's like hero or hoax, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, everybody trying to get their kind of spin on Casey, and so recently just kind of the aftermath of all this is basically just having people kind of showcasing where all they benefited after them kind of uh, being through this whole ordeal. We eventually have it towards Zeke is ultimately on the football team, ultimately having Miss Burke ultimately just kind of waving him on, going like, "Yeah, that's my man," kind of thing. And we ultimately have towards seemingly Delilah and Casey are together, and ultimately Stokely and Stan are together, and just kind of mentioning the aftermath of this whole thing. And so ultimately, yeah, that's where eventually we kind of just lead off towards the end of this movie. So, yeah, just kind of an interesting movie. I thought it was really fun. I liked and enjoyed this movie, so I'm going to like and enjoy my way out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.